She healed a paralyzed, infertile CEO, shared a night of passion, and returned with his miracle triplets. Hi, my very beautiful, loyal, and precious family. How are you today? I love you deeply, my loyal and great family. You mean the world to me. Here's a short but powerful prayer just for you. Dear Lord, bless my beautiful family with peace, joy, and endless love. Wrap them in your grace and keep their hearts warm and strong. Let happiness find them today and always. Amen. My beautiful family, if this touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share, because together we rise again. Comment below, I am Mr. Peter. Let's begin this journey with love. Dr. Sherry Brantner stood outside the private hospital room, studying the chart one last time before meeting her new patient. The name, Edward Graham, was accompanied by a lengthy medical history that told only half the story. What wasn't written, in clinical terms, was the tragedy that had brought this once powerful man to her care, an act of heroism that had cost him everything. Sherry straightened her pristine white coat, running her fingers over the embroidered Dr. Sherry Brantner, neurologist as she did before every challenging case. At 34, she had already made a name for herself in spinal rehabilitation, developing innovative techniques that had helped patients others had given up on. But something about this case felt different. She knocked softly before entering, professional smile in place. Mr. Graham? I'm Dr. Brantner. The man in the wheelchair by the window didn't turn immediately. His broad shoulders, still muscular despite months of immobility, tensed at her voice. When he finally rotated to face her, Sherry was struck by the intensity of his hazel eyes and the coldness within them. Another doctor? His voice was deep, with an edge of bitterness that seemed to cut through the sterile hospital air. Let me guess. You've reviewed my case and have some groundbreaking approach that will have me dancing in no time. Sherry maintained her composure, having encountered this resistance before. Trauma didn't just break bodies, it shattered trust. Actually, Mr. Graham, I don't make promises I can't keep. What I offer is expertise, honesty, and my complete commitment to your recovery, whatever form that might take. Something in her directness caused his expression to shift, if only momentarily. The harsh lines around his mouth softened. Please, call me Ed, he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. And forgive my rudeness. I've become difficult since my accident. I've read your file, Ed, Sherry said, taking the seat. Up close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, evidence of a man who once smiled easily. His dark hair was peppered with premature grey at the temples, and beneath the hospital gown, his upper body remained powerful, a stark contrast to the immobile legs covered by a thin blanket. But I'd like to hear from you what happened. Medical reports only tell part of the story. Ed studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she deserved to know. His gaze travelled over her face, taking in her warm brown eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, the way her braids were gathered elegantly at the nape of her neck. There was something about her that made him want to speak when he'd been silent with the others. My wife and I were at Glacier Peak for our anniversary, he began, his voice distant. She wanted to take photos near the edge. The ground was unstable. I saw it beginning to crumble beneath her feet before she did. He paused, his gaze drifting back to the window where rain streaked the glass, mirroring the pain streaking across his face. I pushed her to safety. The ledge gave way beneath me. Instead, 30-foot drop onto rocks. His words were clinical, detached, as if reciting someone else's tragedy. T10 complete spinal cord injury, paralyzed from the waist down. Sherry nodded, giving him space to continue at his own pace. What came next wasn't in any medical chart. Thought it would bring us closer, Ed said with a hollow laugh. Instead, while I was still in the ICU, she filed for divorce, claiming I'd been emotionally abusive. A complete fabrication, but she knew I couldn't fight her while fighting for my life. His jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the skin. She took half of everything I'd built, my company, my reputation, everything. "I'm sorry, Ed," Sherry said softly, fighting the urge to reach across and take his hand. Something about his vulnerability called to her in a way that felt dangerous. That kind of betrayal, there are no words. "No," he agreed, meeting her eyes directly. "There aren't. So you'll understand why I'm not particularly optimistic about your treatment plan, Dr. Brantner. Hope hasn't served me well lately." Sherry didn't flinch from his gaze. Instead, she leaned forward slightly. "I don't require your optimism, Ed, just your cooperation." She opened his file on her tablet. "You've seen 6 specialists in 8 months. None have offered any long-term solution. They all said the same thing. The damage is irreversible," Ed said flatly. "So why are you here? What makes you different?" Sherry set down the tablet and met his gaze unflinchingly. "Because I don't believe in irreversible. I believe in unexplored possibilities." For the first time, something like interest flickered in Ed's eyes. "That sounds dangerously close to hope, Doctor." "It's science, not sentiment." She stood and moved closer, her presence filling the sterile room with something indefinable. "May I?" Ed nodded, giving permission for her to examine him. Sherry's hands were warm against his skin as she checked his reflexes, assessed muscle tone, and tested for sensation along his legs. Her touch was professional but gentle, and Ed found himself watching the concentration on her face, the slight furrow between her brows, the way she bit her lower lip as she made mental notes. "Your previous doctors focused on the damage to your spinal cord," she said finally, returning to sit across from him. "I want to try something different. There's a new approach I've been developing that combines intensive physical therapy with neural stimulation. It's experimental, but I've seen promising results. And by promising, I mean patients who were told they'd never move again, regaining some function. I'm not promising miracles, Ed. I'm offering possibilities." Ed's expression remained guarded, but something had changed in his eyes. The coldness had given way to something more complex, doubt mixed with the faintest glimmer of interest. "Why me?" he asked suddenly. "I'm sure there are plenty of patients with better attitudes and better prognoses." Sherry smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face, and for a moment made Ed forget about the wheelchair and the pain. Because the most satisfying victories are the ones others say are impossible. She gathered her tablet and stood. "And because beneath all that bitterness, I see someone who hasn't actually given up. You're just afraid to hope again." Ed stared at her, shocked by her perception. For a brief moment, their eyes locked in silent understanding. "Think about it," she said, moving toward the door. "If you decide to work with me, I should warn you. I'm demanding. This won't be easy." "Nothing worth having ever is," Ed replied softly. Sherry paused at the doorway, looking back at him. "We start tomorrow at 9. Rest well, Ed." As the door closed behind her, Ed turned back to the window, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. For the first time in months, something besides anger and bitterness stirred within him. He couldn't name it yet, wouldn't dare call it hope. But as he replayed Dr. Brantner's words in his mind, he found himself wondering what color her eyes would be in sunlight instead of the harsh hospital fluorescence. Outside in the hallway, Sherry leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. Professional detachment had always come easily to her, until now. Something about Ed Graham's story, about the pain behind his eyes and the strength still evident in his bearing, had touched her in ways she hadn't expected. She would help him walk again, if it was humanly possible, she decided, and she would maintain appropriate boundaries while doing so. Yet even as she made this resolution, Sherry couldn't help but remember the electricity she'd felt when their Eyes had met, a current that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with a connection she hadn't felt in years. She straightened her white coat and walked briskly toward her office, already planning tomorrow's session, trying to ignore the way her heart had quickened when he'd looked at her with those penetrating hazel eyes. This was going to be complicated in ways medical school had never prepared her for. Chapter 2. Electric Touch. 9 o'clock sharp, and Sherry was already waiting in the physical therapy room when the orderly wheeled Ed in. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, bathing the space in a warm glow that contrasted with the clinical equipment surrounding them. "Good morning, Ed," Sherry greeted, looking up from her tablet. "I'm glad you decided to join me." Ed nodded, his eyes taking in the room before settling on her. Instead of her white coat, she wore fitted athletic pants and a professional yet form-fitting top that allowed for movement. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing the elegant curve of her neck. "Let's say I'm curious," he replied, his voice less guarded than yesterday. "Though I should warn you, I've tried physical therapy before. It didn't end well for anyone involved." Sherry smiled, undeterred. "That's because you haven't tried my therapy?" She approached his wheelchair, kneeling to be at eye level with him. The sunlight caught the warm brown of her eyes, flecks of gold visible in their depths. "Before we begin, I need to explain my approach. It's not conventional." She held his gaze steadily. "It combines intensive physical manipulation with neural stimulation techniques. The therapy will be intimate at times. I'll be working directly with your body, helping it remember what it's forgotten." Ed swallowed visibly. "Intimate? I'll need to touch you, work with your muscles, stimulate pathways that have gone dormant." Her voice was professional, but there was no denying the charge in the air between them. "If that makes you uncomfortable, we can try something more traditional." "I'm not uncomfortable," Ed said, perhaps too quickly. It's been a while since anyone's touched me with anything but clinical detachment." Something flickered in Sherry's eyes, compassion perhaps, or something deeper. "Then let's begin." She stood and moved to help him onto the padded table. "Can you transfer yourself, or would you like assistance?" "I can manage," Ed said, though as he attempted to shift from the wheelchair, his arms trembled with the effort. Without comment, Sherry stepped forward, her hands strong and sure as they supported him. For a moment, they were close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of her, something clean and faintly tropical that made him think of places far from hospital rooms. As she helped him onto the table, her hands briefly gripped his waist, and even through the thin fabric of his shirt, her touch seemed to burn. "Thank you," he murmured, unable to meet her eyes. "We'll start with assessment," Sherry said, maintaining her professional tone despite the color that had risen to her cheeks. "I need to understand exactly what we're working with." She began by testing his range of motion, her hands moving methodically over his legs. Ed watched her face as she worked, the concentration in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows. When her fingers probed a particularly tight muscle in his thigh, he winced. "Pain?" she asked immediately, her eyes finding his. "Pressure," he clarified. "I can feel something, not pain exactly." Excitement flashed across her features. "That's significant, Ed. Your previous doctors noted complete absence of sensation below the injury site." "It's not exactly sensation," Ed said, cautiously. "More like awareness." "That's how it begins," Sherry said, her voice low with intensity. "The brain creating new pathways, finding ways around the damage." She continued her examination, her hands moving with confident precision. When she reached his feet, she pressed firmly against various points, watching his face for any reaction. "Nothing there," he said, attempting to keep disappointment from his voice. "Yet," Sherry corrected him, her smile unwavering. "Nothing there yet." She moved to a cabinet and returned with several small disc-shaped electrodes and a control unit. "This is where my approach differs," she explained. "These electrodes will stimulate specific neural pathways while we work. It's similar to techniques used for pain management, but I've modified the frequency and intensity." As she began attaching the electrodes to strategic points along his legs, her fingers brushed his skin repeatedly. Each touch sent a strange, dual sensation through Ed, the clinical reality of the procedure overlaid with an awareness of her as a woman, not just a doctor. "The current is very mild," she assured him. "You might feel a tingling or warming sensation. Some patients report nothing at all." When she activated the unit, Ed gasped. It wasn't pain, but a buzzing awareness that radiated from each electrode. Sight. Sherry watched him intently, her hand unconsciously resting on his arm. "What do you feel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alive," he answered honestly. "I feel alive." Something passed between them then, a moment of connection that transcended their doctor-patient relationship. Sherry broke eye contact first, returning to her professional demeanor. "Good. Now we begin the real work." She positioned herself at his feet. "I'm going to move your legs through a series of exercises while the electrodes stimulate the neural pathways. I need you to focus on the movement. Try to visualize yourself controlling it." As she worked, bending and flexing his legs with careful precision, Ed found himself experiencing a cascade of sensations. Her hands moved with professional expertise from his ankles to his calves, each touch distinctly different, sometimes firm as she kneaded muscles that had grown stiff from disuse, sometimes feather-light as she tested neural responses. When she reached his thighs, working the large muscle groups with focused pressure, an unexpected warmth radiated through him that had nothing to do with the electrical stimulation. "Everything all right?" she asked, noticing his sudden tension. "Fine," he managed, willing his body not to betray him. "It's just, I never expected to feel anything in these limbs again. Now I'm discovering different types of sensation. Pressure, warmth even, anticipation of your touch." Sherry's hands paused momentarily. "The body remembers, Ed. Even when the conscious mind cannot access those memories, they're still there, waiting to be awakened." There was something in her voice, a soft intimacy, that made the words seem like more than medical reassurance. The session continued. Sherry guided him through visualization exercises, her voice a melodic cadence that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to his body. Her hands were in constant motion, manipulating his limbs, applying pressure to muscle groups, occasionally adjusting the electrodes. "Now," she said after nearly an hour of work, "I want to try something." She moved to stand at the head of the table, her face above his. "I'm going to run my hands down your legs, and I want you to close your eyes and tell me where you feel the touch end." Ed complied, closing his eyes. He felt her hands start at his hips and move downward, a slow, steady pressure that was both clinical and somehow more intimate than any touch he'd experienced in months. "Here," he said, when her hands reached mid-thigh. "It stops here." "Good," she whispered, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Now again." This time, her touch seemed lighter, more like a caress than clinical pressure. Ed's breath caught as her fingers traced a path down his legs. "Lower," he said, surprised. "I felt it almost to my knees." When he opened his eyes, Sherry was looking at him with an expression of professional triumph, mixed with something more personal. A shared victory. "That's remarkable progress for a first session," she said, stepping back slightly as if needing distance. "The neural pathways are more responsive than I anticipated." Ed pushed himself up on his elbows, studying her. Or maybe it's the practitioner, not the technique. Sherry busied herself with removing the electrodes, her face turned away from him. "We'll continue tomorrow, same time." As she helped him back into the wheelchair, their hands brushed, and for a moment, neither moved away. The contact lingered, their fingers millimeters apart, before Sherry finally stepped back. "Thank you," Ed said, meaning more than just the session. "This is just the beginning," Sherry responded, and somehow they both knew she wasn't talking only about his recovery. "Rest today. Your body has a lot to process." As the orderly arrived to take him back to his room, Ed found himself already anticipating tomorrow's session, the memory of her hands on his body, a phantom sensation that followed him down the corridor. Alone, in the therapy room, Sherry leaned against the treatment table, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The professional boundaries she'd maintained throughout her career had never felt so fragile. There was something about Ed Graham, his vulnerability combined with his innate strength, the way his eyes seemed to see past her professional facade, that resonated with her on a level she hadn't experienced before. "Keep it professional," she whispered to herself, gathering her equipment. But even as she said it, she knew tomorrow couldn't come soon enough, and the anticipation she felt was dangerously close to longing. Chapter 3. Beneath the Surface. 3 weeks into their therapy, sessions and the rehabilitation room had become a sanctuary of sorts, a space where time seemed to operate by different rules. For Ed, it was the only place where hope didn't feel like a dangerous indulgence. For Sherry, it was increasingly a test of her professional resolve. Today, Ed arrived on his own, wheeling himself through the door with newfound confidence. Sherry looked up from preparing the equipment, pleasantly surprised. "Someone's making progress," she remarked, her smile warming her entire face. "I've been practicing," Ed admitted. "Thought I'd surprise you." "Consider me surprised." She moved closer, her lab coat open, to reveal a fitted blouse that accentuated her slender waist. And impressed. The way his eyes lingered on her made her heart quicken. 3 weeks of daily sessions had created a familiarity between them that Sherry found both comforting and concerning. She knew the exact texture of his skin, the resistance of each muscle group, the small intake of breath he made when her touch found a responsive nerve ending. Knowledge that should have remained clinical had somehow become intimate. "Let's see what else you can do today," she said, gesturing toward the treatment table. Ed transferred himself with minimal assistance, his upper body strength having increased remarkably under her care. As he settled onto the table, Sherry noticed his expression change, a shadow passing over his features. "Something wrong?" she asked, preparing the neural stimulation equipment. Ed hesitated, then met her eyes with a directness that had become characteristic of their interactions. "I had a visitor yesterday, my ex-wife's attorney." Sherry paused, giving him her full attention. "What did they want?" "Apparently she's contesting our divorce settlement. Wants more." His laugh was bitter, as if half wasn't enough. Sherry felt a protective anger rise within her. "Can she do that? Legally?" "She's claiming my injury has devalued company shares, so her portion isn't worth what was agreed upon." Ed's hands clenched into fists. "It's not about the money. It's about control. Making sure I remain as helpless as she left me." Without thinking, Sherry placed her hand over his fist. "You're not helpless, Ed. Far from it." He looked down at their hands, then slowly uncurled his fingers, allowing hers to slide between them. The contact was electric, crossing a boundary they'd both been carefully maintaining. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," he said, his voice softer. "About patience being the hardest part of healing." Sherry nodded, reluctantly withdrawing her hand to begin attaching the electrodes. "Most people want instant results, especially in your position." "It's not just the paralysis," Ed said, watching her work with an intensity that made her fingers tremble slightly. "There are other things the accident took from me. Things no amount of therapy can restore." Sherry looked up, sensing the weight behind his words. "What do you mean?" Ed's gaze dropped, a vulnerability in his expression she hadn't seen before. The medications they put me on after the accident, high-dose steroids, anticoagulants, pain management, they had side effects. Understanding dawned on Sherry's face. Fertility issues? Complete infertility, according to 3 different specialists. His jaw tightened. Not that it matters much now. I'm hardly a catch in this condition. Sherry's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine emotion. Don't say that. It's the truth, Ed insisted. What woman wants a man who can't walk? Who can't? He trailed off, embarrassed. Sherry's hands stilled on his leg. Is that what you think? That your worth as a man is tied to your mobility? Isn't it? His eyes challenged her. My wife certainly thought so. Your wife, Sherry said with unusual vehemence, was clearly looking for an excuse to leave long before your accident. And if she couldn't see beyond your injury to the man you are, then she never deserved you in the first place. The passion in her voice surprised them both. A heavy silence filled the room, charged with unspoken currents. The man I am, Ed repeated softly. And who is that exactly? Sherry switched on the neural stimulator before answering, adjusting the settings with practiced ease. When she finally met his gaze again, her professional veneer had returned, but her eyes betrayed deeper emotions. You're someone who saved a woman who didn't deserve saving, she said quietly. Someone who endures pain every day without complaint. Someone who's fighting to rebuild what was taken from him. She began the therapy routine, her hands moving with practiced precision along his legs. That's the kind of strength that matters. Ed, not whether you can walk or run or father children. Ed watched her work, mesmerized by the gentle determination in her movements. You make it sound so simple. Nothing about this is simple, she admitted, her fingers kneading a tight muscle. In his thigh. Especially not... She stopped herself. Especially not what? Ed prompted. Sherry shook her head, focusing intently on his leg. Nothing. Professional boundaries. Ed's hand caught hers, stopping her movement. I think we're well past pretending. This is just another doctor-patient relationship, Sherry. It was the first time he'd used her first name. The intimacy of it hung in the air between them. That's exactly why we shouldn't discuss it, she replied, gently extracting her hand. I'm your doctor, Ed. Your recovery depends on maintaining clear boundaries. And if I don't want those boundaries, his voice was low, challenging. Sherry stepped back, creating physical distance. Then I would have to refer you to another specialist. The thought of not seeing her every day sent a sharp pang through Ed's chest. I apologize. That was inappropriate. No, it was honest. Sherry resumed the therapy, though her touch seemed more careful now, more measured. Honesty is important, but so is timing. They worked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds in the room their breathing and the soft hum of the stimulation machine. Gradually, the tension eased, replaced by the familiar rhythm of their session. Try to move your right foot, Sherry instructed, her hand positioned beneath his heel. Ed concentrated, focusing all his will on the simple movement that had once been effortless. To his surprise, he felt a faint response, not quite movement but an awareness, a connection to the limb that had been absent before. I think I can feel something, he said, excitement edging his voice. Sherry's professional demeanor momentarily vanished, replaced by genuine joy. Try again. This time Ed felt a definite twitch, minute but undeniable. Sherry felt it too, her eyes widening in triumph. You did it, she exclaimed, squeezing his leg in spontaneous celebration. Without thinking, Ed reached for her, pulling her into an embrace. For a heartbeat, she allowed it, her body pressed against his chest, her face buried in the curve of his neck. Then, remembering herself, she pulled back, but not before Ed caught the glimmer of tears in her eyes. That's significant progress, she said, her voice slightly unsteady as she stepped away. Ed couldn't stop smiling. It's more than progress. It's proof you were right. Nothing is irreversible. Sherry busied herself adjusting the equipment, using the moment to compose herself. We should document this. I want to run some additional tests tomorrow. Whatever you say, Doctor, Ed agreed, his tone lighter than she'd ever heard it. I'm in your hands. The phrase hung between them, laden with meaning beyond the literal. Sherry returned to his side, her professional mask firmly in place, though her eyes still shone with shared triumph. Let's continue, she said, her hands resuming their skilled manipulation of his legs. This is just the beginning. As the session progressed, Ed found himself watching her face, more than focusing on the exercises. The way her brow furrowed in concentration, the slight bite of her lower lip when she encountered resistance, the genuine pleasure that transformed her features when she felt progress. These details had become precious to him in ways he couldn't articulate. You haven't asked me about the fertility issue, he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Sherry's hands paused momentarily. It seemed personal, and not directly related to your rehabilitation. It's not, he admitted, but I wanted you to know all of it, the full extent of what I've lost. She met his gaze steadily. Have you considered that what you've lost might make room for something new, something different but equally valuable? Like what? Like perspective, appreciation for what remains, the ability to see value where others might not. Her hands resumed their work, but her eyes remained locked with his. Sometimes our greatest losses lead us to our greatest discoveries. Ed considered her words, feeling something shift inside him, a loosening of the bitterness that had become his constant companion. Is that what you tell all your hopeless cases? He asked, though there was no edge to his words. Sherry's smile was gentle. Only the ones who aren't actually hopeless. As she finished the session, disconnecting the electrodes and helping him sit up, their faces came momentarily close. Close enough that Ed could see the flecks of amber in her brown eyes. Close enough to catch the faint scent of her perfume. For a heartbeat, neither moved away. The air between them seemed charged with possibilities, with words unspoken and feelings denied. Then Sherry stepped back, her professional smile returning. Same time tomorrow, and I want you to start a new exercise regimen in the evenings. I'll write it up for you. Ed nodded, already missing her touch, though she stood just feet away. Thank you, Dr. Brantner. Her expression softened at his deliberate use of her title. You're welcome, Mr. Graham. As he wheeled himself out, Ed realized that for the first time since his accident, he was looking forward to tomorrow, not just for the promise of physical improvement, but for the hours he would spend in this room with this remarkable woman who saw in him something more than a broken body. Alone in the therapy room, Sherry leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. This was dangerous territory. Ed Graham was becoming more than a patient to her, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. Her career, her professional ethics, her carefully constructed boundaries, all were at risk. Yet when she remembered the feeling of his foot moving beneath her hand, the joy in his eyes, the warmth of his embrace, she couldn't bring herself to regret the path they were on. Perspective, she whispered to herself, echoing the advice she'd given him. Perhaps it was time she took her own counsel and considered that some risks were worth taking, some boundaries worth reconsidering. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it choices that would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Chapter 4. Forbidden Desires. 6 weeks into Ed's treatment, and something had fundamentally changed. The hospital corridor no longer felt sterile and hopeless as he wheeled himself toward the rehabilitation room. Instead, it had become a pathway to the hours he most looked forward to each day. Hours spent under the skilled hands and watchful eyes of Dr. Sherry Brantner. Ed paused outside the door, taking a moment to compose himself. Last night's dream still lingered in his mind. Sherry's hands on his body, not clinical but caressing, her lips close to his ear, whispering encouragement as he stood on his own feet and pulled her into his arms. He'd woken breathless, the phantom, sensation of her touch still tingling across his skin. These dreams had become increasingly frequent and vivid as sensation returned to parts of his body. It was as though his nervous system, reawakening under her care, expressed its gratitude in the language of desire. Taking a deep breath, Ed pushed open the door to find Sherry already waiting, dressed in slim-fitting athletic wear instead of her usual lab coat. "Different approach today?" he asked, trying to keep his eyes from lingering on the graceful curve of her waist. Sherry smiled, the warm expression lighting her eyes. "Hydrotherapy. I've booked the therapeutic pool." She gestured to a bag beside her. "I brought swimming shorts for you. The water will support your weight while allowing greater range of motion." Ed felt a momentary panic. "I haven't been in water since before." Sherry approached, kneeling beside his wheelchair as she often did to maintain eye contact. The gesture had once seemed clinical. Now it felt intimate, a physical manifestation of how she saw him as an equal, not a patient to be talked down. "2. The water will be your ally, not your enemy," she said softly, "and I'll be with you the entire time." The promise in those words calmed him, though it stirred other emotions he struggled to contain. "I trust you," he said simply. Something flickered in her eyes. Pleasure, perhaps, or recognition of the weight those words carried from a man who had learned the hard way how dangerous trust could be. "Then let's begin." The therapeutic pool was in the quiet corner of the hospital's rehabilitation wing, a private oasis of blue water and gentle light from skylights above. After helping Ed change in the adjacent room, a process that involved carefully averted eyes and professional distance that felt more performative with each passing day, Sherry guided his wheelchair to the pool's edge. She was already in the water, having changed into a modest but form-fitting black swimsuit that revealed more of her than Ed had ever seen. The sight of her smooth brown skin, glistening with droplets of water, made his throat go dry. "Ready?" she asked, extending her hands to him. The transfer into the water was awkward, requiring Sherry to support much of his weight. For precious seconds, they were pressed together, her arms around his waist, his hands on her shoulders. The water embraced them both, creating a bubble of privacy in which the outside world and its rules seemed distant. "I've got you," she murmured, as she guided him to float on his back, her hands supporting him beneath the surface. The sensation was extraordinary. Weightlessness combined with the gentle pressure of water against his skin and the warm points of contact where Sherry's hands touched him. "How does it feel?" she asked, her face close to his as she guided him through the water. "Like freedom," Ed replied honestly. "Like remembering what it was to move without thinking about every muscle and nerve." Sherry's smile was radiant. "That's exactly what we want. The water helps your body remember patterns of movement that your injury interrupted." For the next hour, she guided him through a series of exercises, her hands constantly adjusting his position, supporting his limbs, directing his movements. In the water, the line between therapeutic touch and caress seemed to blur. When her fingers trailed along his leg to position it, the sensation traveled through his recovering nervous system like electricity. "I felt that," he said suddenly, surprised, "all the way to my ankle." Sherry's eyes widened with professional excitement. "That's significant progress. Let me try something." She moved to stand at his feet, her hands gripping his ankles beneath the water. "Close your eyes. Tell me where you feel my touch." Ed complied, letting his eyes drift shut. Her hands began a slow journey up his legs, a gentle but deliberate pressure that felt nothing like her usual clinical touch. "Ankles," he murmured, as her fingers circled the bones there. Calves, as her hands smoothed upward. Knees, as her touch lingered at the joint. Thighs, as her fingers pressed more firmly against muscle. When he opened his eyes, Sherry was watching him with an expression that mingled professional satisfaction with something more personal, a hunger that matched his own. "Your nervous system is re-establishing pathways," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "The progress is remarkable." "Is it the treatment?" Ed asked, holding her gaze. "Or the one providing it?" The question hung between them, too direct to ignore. Sherry broke eye contact first, moving back to a more professional distance. "Both, perhaps," she admitted. "The mind-body connection is powerful. When a patient trusts their practitioner, believes in the treatment, when they can't stop thinking about their doctor even when the session is over," Ed finished, the water giving him a courage he might not have found on dry land. Sherry's eyes flew to his, surprise and something deeper reflected in them. "Ed, I dream about you," he confessed, his voice low, "not just about walking again, about you. Your hands, your voice, your smile." A flush spread across Sherry's cheeks. "This is dangerous territory," she warned, though she made no move to create further distance between them. "I know," Ed acknowledged, "but I think we passed the point of professional detachment weeks ago, haven't we?" Instead of answering, Sherry guided him to the edge of the pool, helping him grip the rail. "Let's try something. Put your feet on the bottom, I'll support your weight." The change of subject was obvious, but Ed allowed it, focusing on the task at hand. With Sherry's arms around his waist, he found his feet touching the pool floor, his legs bearing a fraction of his weight under the water's buoyancy. "That's it," Sherry encouraged, her face close to his. "Feel the ground beneath you. Remember what it's like to stand." The position brought them chest to chest, her arms encircling him, his hands gripping the rail behind her. To anyone observing, it would have appeared a standard therapeutic pose, but the energy between them was anything but standard. "I feel it," Ed whispered, and they both knew he meant more than just the pool floor beneath his feet. "Ed," Sherry began, her professional resolve visibly wavering as she looked up at him. "I can't—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking you to compromise your ethics. I'm just asking you to acknowledge what's happening." For a long moment they remained frozen in that embrace, water lapping softly around them, their faces inches apart. Then Sherry slowly disentangled herself, helping him back to a floating position. "Time's almost up," she said, her voice steadier than her expression. "Let's get you back to the chair." The return transfer was executed with careful precision, both of them acutely aware of every point of contact. Once Ed was settled back in his wheelchair, towel draped around his shoulders, Sherry knelt before him again. "Tomorrow I'd like to try something different," she said, her professional demeanor firmly back in place, though her eyes still betrayed her inner conflict. "A combination of electrical stimulation and weight-bearing exercises. I think you're ready. Whatever you recommend, Doctor," Ed replied, deliberately using her title, offering her the safety of their established roles. Sherry's smile held gratitude for this small mercy. "Meet me on the hospital roof garden after dinner tonight," she said suddenly, surprising them both. "There's a therapy technique I want to discuss. The change of scenery might be beneficial." Ed's heart raced at the invitation. "Is that standard protocol?" "No," she admitted, meeting his eyes directly. "But then, nothing about your case has been standard." As she helped him change and they went their separate ways, Sherry tried to justify her decision professionally. The roof garden provided an ideal environment for testing balance in a natural setting. The evening air would stimulate different sensory responses. The privacy would allow Ed to attempt standing without an audience of other patients or medical staff. But beneath these rationalizations lay a truth she could no longer deny. The boundaries between them had been eroding daily, despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance. Each touch, Each shared triumph, each moment of vulnerability, had woven connections that transcended the clinical relationship. Perhaps, she thought with equal parts trepidation and anticipation, it was time to acknowledge what was happening between them, rather than pretending it didn't exist. After she'd helped him change, and they'd gone their separate ways, she to her office, he to his room, Ed found himself counting the hours until evening. Whether it was the anticipation of new treatment options or simply the thought of seeing Sherry outside the confines of their therapy sessions, he couldn't say. Perhaps it was both. In her office, Sherry stared at her reflection in the darkened computer screen. The woman looking back at her seemed different, flushed, alive in a way she hadn't been in years. Professionally, she knew she was treading dangerous ground. Personally, she was already falling, had been falling since that first day when Ed's wounded eyes had met hers with such raw honesty. "This isn't like you," she whispered to her reflection. But perhaps that was precisely the point. Ed Graham made her feel like a version of herself she'd never known. Braver, more passionate, more willing to risk. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital grounds, both Ed and Sherry found themselves looking toward evening with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, knowing that whatever happened on the roof garden would irrevocably change the careful balance they'd been maintaining. Some boundaries, once crossed, could never be re-established, and some temptations were too powerful to resist, especially when disguised as healing. Chapter 5. Breakthrough. The hospital roof garden was transformed by twilight, the institutional severity softened by the golden hour's gentle glow. Potted plants and wooden benches created an oasis above the clinical world below, and the city skyline provided a backdrop that reminded visitors there was life beyond illness and recovery. Ed arrived first, having navigated the elevator and pathways with increasing confidence. He positioned his wheelchair near the eastern edge, where the view was most expansive, and waited, his heart keeping a rhythm that had nothing to do with medical concerns. When the door opened and Sherry stepped out, the last rays of sunlight caught her, illuminating her in a way that made Ed's breath catch. She'd changed from her professional attire into a simple sundress that moved with her as she walked, her braids loose around her shoulders instead of in their usual professional arrangement. "You came," she said, as if she'd half expected him. "To reconsider. Wild horses couldn't have kept me away," Ed replied with a smile that transformed his face, erasing the lines of pain and bitterness that had become so familiar. Sherry approached, carrying a small bag. "I brought dinner. Hospital food leaves much to be desired." She settled on a bench adjacent to his wheelchair, unpacking containers of fragrant food. The domesticity of the gesture struck Ed. How long had it been since someone had thought about his comfort, his pleasure beyond the clinical necessities? "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. Sherry looked up, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "I wanted to." She handed him a container. "Jerk chicken, rice and peas, plantains. My grandmother's recipe." As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, touching on topics far removed from spinal injuries and rehabilitation protocols. Ed spoke of his childhood in Boston, of sailing with his father on weekends. Sherry shared stories of growing up in Atlanta, of the extended family gatherings that had shaped her understanding of community. "Is that why you became a doctor?" Ed asked, watching her face as she spoke. "Because of your family?" Sherry nodded, setting aside her empty container. "My uncle had an accident when I was 10. Fell from a construction site. The doctors said he'd never walk again." She smiled at the memory. 6 months later, he danced at my cousin's wedding. Not well, mind you. He had 2 left feet even before the accident, but he danced. That's why you believe so strongly in possibilities, Ed realized. It's why I know the body has wisdom beyond what medical textbooks can capture, she corrected, gently, and why I recognize the light in your eyes that others might have missed, the determination, the will to heal. Their gazes held longer than professional propriety would allow. In the deepening twilight, the boundaries between doctor and patient seemed as intangible as the line between horizon and sky. You mentioned a new therapy technique, Ed prompted, though he suspected the invitation had been about more than treatment options. Sherry stood, moving to stand before him. Yes, it builds on the progress we've made. She extended her hands. May I? Ed placed his hands in hers, the contact sending a now familiar current through him. With gentle pressure, she guided his wheelchair closer to the bench. The technique combines visualization with physical support, she explained, her professional tone at odds with the intimacy of the setting. I want you to try standing, using the bench and my support. Ed's eyes widened. Standing? But the most I've managed is partial weight-bearing in the pool. Trust me, Sherry said simply, her eyes never leaving his. And he did. With her guidance, Ed positioned his feet flat on the ground, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. Sherry stood before him, offering her hands for support. Focus on the connection between your mind and body, she instructed softly. Feel the intention to stand flowing from your thoughts to your muscles. Ed closed his eyes, concentrating on the sensation of Sherry's hands in his, using it as an anchor as he visualized the complex sequence of muscle contractions required to rise from sitting to standing. Now, Sherry whispered, beginning to pull gently upward. Ed pushed with his arms, but to his astonishment, he also felt response from his legs, a trembling engagement of muscles that had been dormant for so long. With excruciating slowness, he began to rise. Pain shot through his back and legs, but it was a different kind of pain than he'd become accustomed to. Not the deadened ache of damaged nerves, but the vibrant protest of muscles being asked to perform long-forgotten functions. A rush of sensation flooded upward through his body, the weight shifting through his hips, the pressure against the soles of his feet, the exquisite agony of tendons and ligaments stretching after months of disuse. I've got you, Sherry encouraged, her face alight with a mixture of professional triumph and personal joy. Just a little more. With a final surge of effort, Ed found himself upright, trembling but standing, supported by Sherry's hands and his own shaking legs. The world looked different from this height, not just physically but symbolically, as though he'd regained not just stance, but stature, dignity, possibility. My God, he breathed, tears streaming unchecked down his face. I'm standing. Sherry's own eyes overflowed, tears catching the last golden rays of sunset. Yes, you are. The moment stretched between them, profound in its simplicity, yet monumental in its significance. After 18 months of darkness and limitation, of being talked down to both literally and figuratively, Ed Graham stood eye to eye with the woman, who had helped him reclaim not just mobility, but humanity. For a suspended moment, they stood facing each other, hands clasped between them, the achievement too momentous for words. Then Ed's legs began to buckle. Easy, Sherry cautioned, stepping closer to support him, one arm sliding around his waist. Don't push too hard the first time. But Ed wasn't ready to return to his chair, not yet. Not when he could feel Sherry's warmth against him, see the pride, and something deeper shining in her eyes. Not when, for the first time in 18 months, he felt like a whole man. Thank you, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, for believing when no one else did, for seeing me, not just my injury. Sherry's professional mask slipped completely, revealing vulnerability that matched his own. You did the work, Ed. I just showed you the path. You showed me more than that, he countered, one trembling hand releasing hers to touch her cheek. You showed me there could be life after everything was taken, that I could feel again, not just physically. The confession hung between them, too honest to be denied, too powerful to be ignored. Sherry's breath caught, her lips parting slightly. As she looked up at him, "Ed," she began, a final warning, "I'm your doctor. In this moment," he said softly, "we're just two people who found each other when they needed it most." The last light of day disappeared beyond the horizon as Ed lowered his head, giving Sherry every chance to step away. Instead, she rose slightly, on her toes, closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. When Sherry responded, her lips softening under his, the tender exchange deepened into something hungry and reverent at once. Ed's arm tightened around her waist, drawing her closer, while Sherry's hands moved to his shoulders, steadying them both. The kiss seemed to exist outside of time, a culmination of weeks of restrained desire and growing connection. In it was every lingering touch disguised as therapy, every glance that lasted too long, every unspoken thought that had passed between them. When they finally parted, breathless, the city lights twinkled around them like earthbound stars. Reality began to seep back in, bringing with it the weight of what they'd just done. "I shouldn't have," Sherry began, stepping back slightly, though her hands remained on his shoulders. "Don't," Ed interrupted gently. "Don't regret it. I don't." But the conflict was clear in her eyes as she helped him back into his wheelchair, her movements now careful, deliberately professional, despite the intimacy they'd just shared. "What happens now?" Ed asked as she gathered the remains of their dinner, her back to him. Sherry turned, her expression a complex mix of emotions. "I don't know," she admitted. "This is uncharted territory for me." "For us both," Ed agreed, "but maybe that's appropriate. Everything about my recovery has been uncharted. Why should this be different?" A sad smile touched Sherry's lips. "Because there are consequences beyond what either of us might anticipate. Because I took an oath to do no harm, and I'm not certain I can keep that oath if we continue down this path." "Are you saying you'll stop treating me?" The thought sent a cold spike of fear through Ed's chest. Sherry's hands tightened on the bag she held. "I'm saying I have to consider what's truly in your best interest, and my feelings for you may be clouding my clinical judgment. My best interest is continuing to work with the only doctor who's helped me make real progress," Ed argued. "The only person who's made me feel like more than a collection of damaged nerves and compromised mobility. And if that's precisely the problem," Sherry countered, "if your progress is tied to feelings that cross professional boundaries, what happens when those feelings change or complicate?" Ed wheeled closer, reaching for her hand. "Then we navigate that together, as we've navigated everything else." For a moment it seemed Sherry might yield to the plea in his eyes. Then, with visible effort, she straightened her shoulders. "I need time to think," she said finally, "to make sure whatever decision I make is based on what's genuinely best for your recovery." It wasn't the answer Ed wanted, but he respected her too much to press further. "I understand," he said quietly. "But know this. Whatever you decide, my feelings won't change. What happened between us wasn't a mistake or a momentary weakness. It was inevitable from the moment you walked into my hospital room and saw the man behind the injury." Sherry's composure wavered at his words. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his cheek in a touch that held both tenderness and farewell. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said softly, "for your regular session." As she turned to leave, the distance between them seemed to grow exponentially, no longer measured in physical space, but in the ethical boundaries she was struggling to re-establish. Alone on the roof garden, Ed looked out at the city lights, his heart fuller than it had been in months, despite the uncertainty. He had stood today, felt the kiss of a woman who saw him as whole. Whatever came next, those victories could not be taken from him. Back in her office, Sherry sat at her desk, the taste of Ed's kiss still on her lips, the memory of his arms around her waist, making it impossible to focus on the patient files before her. She had crossed a line tonight, a line that years of medical training and professional ethics had drawn clearly in the sand. And yet, as she touched her fingers to her lips, remembering the look in Ed's eyes as he stood before her, she couldn't bring herself to regret it entirely. Something profound had happened on that rooftop. Not just a kiss, but a reclamation of possibility, of life after devastation. The question that now burned in her mind was whether she could honor both her oath as a doctor and the feelings that had grown unbidden in her heart. Whether there was a path forward that wouldn't require sacrificing one for the other. As the night deepened outside her window, Sherry made the most difficult decision of her professional career, one that would alter both their paths in ways neither could yet imagine. Chapter 6. Separate Paths. Dr. Walter Chen will be taking over your rehabilitation going forward, Sherry said, her voice professionally neutral as she stood beside a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Ed stared at her, searching for some flicker of emotion behind her composed facade. Just 3 days had passed since their kiss on the rooftop. 3 days of tense, overly formal therapy sessions where they'd both pretended nothing had changed. "I see," Ed replied, his own voice carefully controlled. "May I ask why?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Dr. Chen glanced between them, sensing the undercurrents he wasn't privy to. "I'll give you two a moment," he said tactfully, stepping out of the room. Once the door closed, Sherry's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the conflict beneath. "You know why, Ed," she said softly. "What happened on the roof was honest," Ed finished. "The first truly honest moment I've had since the accident." Sherry looked away, her hands clasped tightly before her. "That's exactly the problem. I can't be your doctor, and whatever else we might become, it's not fair to you or your recovery. So instead of figuring it out together, you're walking away." Ed couldn't keep the hurt from his voice. "I'm ensuring you get the best medical care without complications." Sherry finally met his eyes. Dr. Chen is brilliant. His approach to neural regeneration is groundbreaking. He'll take you further than I could now that my judgment is compromised. Compromised, Ed repeated bitterly. "Is that what you call it when two people connect on a level beyond the clinical, when they see each other as human beings, not just doctor and patient?" Sherry's composure threatened to crack. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." "Then tell me one thing," Ed demanded. "Was it just professional ethics that made you decide this? Or are you afraid of what might happen if you let yourself feel something for a man who might never fully recover?" The accusation hit its mark. Sherry's eyes flashed with hurt and indignation. "That's not fair, isn't it? Your uncle danced at your cousin's wedding, a miraculous recovery that shaped your entire career. But what if I don't? Get my miracle, Sherry, what if this," he gestured to his wheelchair, "is as good as it gets? Could you love half a man?" "You've never been half a man," Sherry said fiercely, her control finally breaking. "Not to me, not from the first day. And that's precisely why I have to step away, because I can't be objective anymore, and you deserve a doctor who can see your case clearly without their heart getting in the way." The admission hung in the air between them, too honest to take back, too painful to acknowledge fully. Ed's anger deflated, replaced by a resignation that felt worse. "So this is goodbye?" "It's goodbye to being your doctor," Sherry corrected gently. "The rest, time will tell." But they both knew that without the structure of their daily sessions, without the legitimate reason to be in each other's lives, whatever had been growing between them would likely wither from neglect. "I wish you every success, Ed," Sherry said, formally extending her hand in a gesture that felt absurdly inadequate after the intimacy they'd shared. Ed took it, holding on a moment longer than necessary. "Be happy, Dr. Brantner. The use of her title wasn't lost on either of them. As Sherry walked out of the rehabilitation room for the last time, neither could have articulated the depth of loss they felt. A severing that went beyond professional ties to something far more profound. 3 months passed. Winter gave way to spring. Trees budding outside Ed's apartment window. He'd been discharged from the hospital 6 weeks after Sherry transferred his case, continuing outpatient therapy with Dr. Chen 3 times a week. Each morning, Ed woke before dawn to complete the additional exercises he'd designed for himself, pushing beyond Chen's recommendations, beyond what was comfortable or safe. His physical therapists warned him about overdoing it, but Ed was driven by a force they couldn't understand. Every step, every movement, every millimeter of progress was for her. If he couldn't have Sherry in his life, he could at least become the man she had believed he could be. Nights were the hardest. In the quiet darkness, memories of her hands guiding him, her voice encouraging him, her smile celebrating his smallest victories would flood back with painful clarity. On those nights, he would push himself until exhaustion guaranteed dreamless sleep. "Remarkable progress," Chen commented during their session, watching Ed navigate the parallel bars with forearm crutches. "Your determination is paying off." Ed nodded, focusing intently on each step. The pain was considerable, but pain had become a companion he'd learned to embrace, proof he was alive, healing, moving forward. Behind him lay a trail of sweat droplets on the floor, testament to the effort each movement still required. "How much longer?" he asked, reaching the end of the bars and turning with painstaking precision. Chen observed his gait analytically. Until I can walk without assistance." The doctor's expression remained carefully neutral. "That's difficult to predict. The nervous system doesn't heal on a timetable." "Dr. Brantner would have given me a straight answer," Ed said before he could stop himself. Chen's eyes softened with understanding. "You miss her approach." "Something like that," Ed admitted, completing another length of the bars. He didn't share that he missed everything about her. The way her eyes lit up when he made progress, the gentle pressure of her hands guiding his movements, the scent of her perfume that had somehow cut through the antiseptic hospital smell, making each session feel less clinical and more human. "She's doing groundbreaking work," Chen offered. "Her research into neural regeneration is causing quite a stir in medical circles." Ed's step faltered. "You've spoken with her?" "At a conference last month. She presented a case study based on your early treatment. Anonymized, of course. They're calling it the Graham Protocol now, a revolutionary approach combining intensive physical therapy with specific neural stimulation patterns." Ed gripped the parallel bars tighter, steadying himself against the emotional impact of her words. "She named it after me," Chen nodded. "The medical community doesn't know that, of course, but yes, your case inspired the methodology that's helping dozens of patients now. She's expanded the approach to include new techniques, but the foundation is what she developed with you." Something like pride warmed Ed's chest, mingled with a deeper ache. She always believed recovery was possible when others didn't. "Her faith has been vindicated," Chen said, gesturing to Ed's upright position. 6 months ago, no one would have predicted you'd be walking with minimal assistance. 6 months ago, Ed had been trapped in bitterness and despair until a doctor, with kind eyes and unyielding determination, had seen the man beneath the injury. The irony wasn't lost on him. He owed his physical recovery to Sherry, yet that very recovery had cost him the chance to explore what might have grown between them. Across town, Sherry stared at the brain scans displayed on her computer, notes scattered across her desk. Late-night research had become her refuge. The long hours a balm for thoughts that still drifted to Ed, despite her best efforts. "You're still here." Dr. Fatima Khoury, the department head, stood in her doorway. Sherry glanced at the clock, surprised to find it was past midnight. "Lost track of time," Fatima entered, examining the scans with interest. The Graham protocol is showing promising results in the trial patients. Sherry's heart contracted at the name she'd given her treatment approach, a private acknowledgement of the man who'd inspired it. The combination of intensive physical therapy and targeted neural stimulation seems particularly effective in cases previously deemed irreversible, she said, keeping her voice professionally detached. The medical board is impressed, Fatima noted. There's talk of expanding the trial nationally. That would be wonderful, Sherry managed, though the thought of her treatment helping others brought a bittersweet pang. The one person she most wanted to help was no longer her patient. You should be celebrating, not burning midnight oil, Fatima observed, studying her with shrewd eyes. This could define your career, Sherry smiled without humor. What better way to celebrate than more research? After Fatima left, Sherry leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a rare moment of honesty. Professional success felt hollow without someone to share it with. In the months since transferring Ed's case, she'd thrown herself into research, published 2 papers, and developed a treatment protocol that might change countless lives. Yet she still found herself wondering if he was continuing his progress. If he'd regained more function, if he still thought of their kiss beneath the twilight sky as often as she did. Taking out her phone, she pulled up an article she'd saved, a business piece mentioning Edward Graham's return to the corporate world, not as CEO of his former company, but as founder of a new venture focused on adaptive technology for individuals with spinal injuries. The accompanying photo showed him at a product launch, seated in a sleek wheelchair but looking vibrant and engaged, so different from the bitter man she'd first met. Her finger traced his face on the screen, pride and longing mingling in her chest. She'd made the right decision professionally. She knew that. The ethical boundaries existed for a reason, and crossing them would have compromised them both. Yet, in her most honest moments, Sherry wondered if she'd sacrificed something rare and precious on the altar of professional propriety, a connection that might have healed them both in ways medicine never could. You need to get out more, Marcus, Ed's physical therapist and newfound friend, insisted as he helped Ed with resistance training. All work and no play makes Ed a dull CEO. Ed grunted as he completed the set of exercises. The foundation is taking off. Adaptive tech development doesn't leave much time for socializing. Which is why you're coming to the charity gala next Friday, Marcus declared. The Spinal Research Foundation's annual fundraiser. Your perfect crowd, doctors, researchers, potential investors for your technology. I don't do well at those things anymore, Ed demurred, though his resistance was weaker than usual. You do fine, Marcus countered, and it's time you stepped back into the world fully. 6 months of rehab, and you're walking with forearm crutches. That's worth celebrating. Ed considered the invitation. The old Ed would have dominated such an event, working the room with confident ease. The new Ed was more hesitant, more vulnerable, but also more authentic in ways his former self had never been. Fine, he conceded, but I'm not staying long. Linger. Enough to make connections, Marcus grinned. Both professional and personal. There'll be plenty of brilliant, accomplished women there. Ed managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm not looking for brilliant women. Just one, his mind added, silently. Just one who had seen possibility where others saw limitation, who had challenged him to hope when hope seemed foolish, whose touch had awakened not just dormant nerves, but a heart he'd thought permanently damaged as he worked through the remainder. Of his exercises, Ed wondered what Sherry was doing at that moment, if she was helping another patient find their way back from darkness, if she ever thought of the man whose life she'd transformed in ways that went far beyond the physical. 6 months had passed since their paths had diverged. 6 months of separate journeys, separate healing, yet despite the passage of time, despite the physical distance, the memory of her remained as vivid as the moment she'd walked out of his life. Little did he know that fate, having brought them together once under the most unlikely circumstances, was preparing to intervene again. At a charity gala, neither was particularly eager to attend. Chapter 7. Fated Reunion. The Spinal Research Foundation's annual gala transformed the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom into a glittering sea of evening wear and champagne flutes. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the assembled guests. Physicians, researchers, philanthropists, and survivors, all united by their commitment to advancing treatment for spinal injuries. Dr. Sherry Brantner stood near the edge of the room, a vision in a midnight blue gown that complemented her deep brown skin. Her braids were arranged in an elegant updo, a few tendrils framing her face. Despite the attention her recent publications had garnered, several colleagues had already approached to discuss her groundbreaking protocol. She found herself distracted, constantly scanning the crowd without admitting to herself who she was looking for. "Your research has caused quite a stir," Dr. Brantner, Dr. Elaine Watson, a leading neurologist from Chicago, commented. "The combination of targeted stimulation and intensive therapy is showing remarkable results in cases previously considered irreversible." Sherry managed a gracious smile. "The patients deserve the credit. Their determination makes the protocol effective." "Always modest," Elaine laughed. "But we both know innovation requires the right practitioner with the right insight. Your case, study subject, the anonymous CEO, his progress was particularly impressive." Before Sherry could respond, a ripple of interest moved through the nearby guests. She followed their gazes to the entrance, where a familiar figure had appeared. Ed Graham stood in the doorway, leaning lightly on a single cane rather than the forearm crutches she'd heard he was using. His tuxedo was impeccably tailored, disguising the supportive bracing she knew he must be wearing beneath it. His hair was shorter than when she'd last seen him, the premature grey at his temples lending him a distinguished air, and he carried himself with quiet dignity that commanded attention without demanding it. Sherry's heart performed a complicated maneuver in her chest, part joy at seeing him, part pride at his evident progress, part trepidation about facing him after months of separation. "Excuse me," she murmured to Elaine, setting down her untouched champagne, but before she could decide whether to approach him or retreat further into the crowd, Ed's gaze swept the room and locked with hers. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other across the glittering expanse, the months of separation collapsing like a paper fan. Ed said something to the man beside him, his physical therapist, Sherry realized, and began making his way toward her. His gait was careful but steady, each step a testament to months of grueling rehabilitation. Sherry remained rooted in place, watching his approach with a mixture of professional admiration and personal longing that she'd never fully managed to disentangle. "Dr. Brantner," Ed greeted her when he finally stood before her, his voice warming the formal address. "Mr. Graham," she returned, equally formal, though her eyes betrayed deeper emotions. "You're walking beautifully." "I had an excellent foundation to build upon," he replied, the double meaning clear in his gaze. "Your treatment protocol gave me the start I needed." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the cacophony of the gala fading to background noise. "How have you been?" Ed asked finally, his question encompassing far more than professional inquiry. "Busy," Sherry answered truthfully. "Research, publications, clinical trials." "I've read your papers," Ed admitted. "Every one of them. Your approach is changing lives." The knowledge that he'd followed her work sent warmth spreading through her chest. "And you? I've seen news of your foundation, adaptive technology for spinal injury patients. It's impressive work." It gives purpose to what happened, Ed said simply, a way to make meaning from loss. The orchestra began playing a waltz, the music sweeping across the ballroom. Ed's expression turned hesitant, vulnerable in a way that reminded Sherry of their early sessions together. "Would you dance with me, Dr. Brantner?" he asked quietly. "I've been practicing, but I'm still not very good." The request caught her off guard. "Are you sure that's wise?" "Medically speaking," a smile touched his lips. "I'm no longer your patient. You don't have to worry about my medical welfare anymore." The reminder hung between them. They were no longer bound by the professional relationship that had both connected and separated them. "In that case," Sherry said softly, "I'd be honored." Ed offered his arm, and she placed her hand lightly upon it, conscious of not disturbing his balance as they moved toward the dance floor. A few heads turned to watch their progress. Ed Graham's recovery was well known in these circles. His presence at the gala a testament to advances in treatment. On the dance floor, Ed carefully positioned himself, one hand taking hers, the other resting lightly at her waist. His cane hung from his wrist by its strap, unneeded but available. "I should warn you," he murmured as they began to move to the music. "If I step on your toes, it's not entirely due to my injury. I was a terrible dancer even before." The admission startled a laugh from Sherry, easing the tension between them. "I'll consider myself warned." They moved slowly, their steps more of a gentle sway than a true waltz, but the simple fact that Ed was standing, moving in rhythm, supporting his weight while holding her close, felt like a miracle neither took for granted. "I've missed you," Ed said after several moments, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "More than I can adequately express." Sherry's careful composure wavered. "Professional ethics no longer apply," Ed finished gently. "I'm not asking you to compromise your principles, Sherry. I'm just telling you the truth. These months without you have been empty, despite all the progress and new ventures." She looked up at him, searching his face. "I've missed you too," she admitted finally, the confession both a relief and a risk. "I've thought about you every day." Something in Ed's expression lightened, as though a burden had been lifted. His arm tightened fractionally around her waist, drawing her closer as they continued their careful dance. "When you transferred my case," he said, "I was angry. I felt abandoned just when I was starting to believe in possibilities again." "It was the hardest decision I've ever made," Sherry confessed, "but it was the right one. Dr. Chen is brilliant, Dr. Chen is excellent," Ed acknowledged. "But he didn't look at me the way you did, like I was a whole person, not just a collection of damaged nerves." The music swelled around them, other couples moving in graceful patterns that contrasted with their measured steps. Yet in their careful dance was an honesty that made it more intimate than any polished waltz. "What happens now?" Sherry asked, echoing the question Ed had posed on the roof garden months before. "Now," Ed said thoughtfully, "we have dinner somewhere. Quiet, away from colleagues and medical discussions. We talk as Ed and Sherry, not doctor and patient. We discover who we are to each other without those roles defining us." The simplicity of his proposal, its focus on genuine connection rather than past complications, touched something deep within her. "I'd like that," she said softly. As the dance ended, they remained close for a moment longer than necessary, reluctant to break the connection they'd re-established. Finally, with quiet words to their respective colleagues, they slipped away from the gala, leaving behind the glittering crowd for the promise of honest conversation. The restaurant Ed chose was an intimate bistro several blocks from the hotel, its amber lighting and secluded booths creating an atmosphere of privacy without pretension. As they settled across from each other, the maitre d' discreetly removing Ed's cane to hang nearby, Sherry felt a curious blend of nervousness and comfort, the paradoxical feeling of coming home to a place she'd never been. 6 months, Ed Said, his eyes never leaving her face. 6 months of wondering if I'd see you again, if you ever thought about what might have been. I more than thought about it, Sherry admitted, the intimate setting making honesty easier. I questioned my decision daily, even knowing it was professionally correct. And now, Ed asked, now that we're here, with no professional relationship between us, Sherry looked at him, really looked, taking in not just his physical progress, but the man himself. The bitterness that had dominated his expression when they first met had been replaced by a quiet strength, a hard-won wisdom that suited him. Now I find myself wondering if we can build something real from such an unusual beginning, she said truthfully. If what we felt was genuine connection or just intensity born from extraordinary circumstances. Ed considered her words, his response thoughtful rather than defensive. That's a fair question. Trauma creates bonds that aren't always sustainable outside the crisis. But what I felt, what I continue to feel, has only grown clearer with distance and time. The arrival of wine provided a brief interlude in their conversation. As they ordered dinner, Sherry found herself studying Ed's movements, the increased coordination, the subtle compensations for remaining weakness, the evidence of months of disciplined work. "Tell me about your foundation," she invited once they were alone again. The articles mentioned adaptive technology, but were light on specifics. Ed's face animated with genuine passion. "We're developing everyday tools that accommodate varying levels of mobility and strength, from kitchen implements to office equipment, things that allow people with spinal injuries to maintain independence without constant assistance." "That's remarkable," Sherry said, genuinely impressed. "You've turned personal adversity into innovation." "You inspired it," Ed admitted. "Your belief that limitations could be worked around rather than surrendered to. I wanted to extend that. Philosophy beyond medical treatment." The acknowledgement warmed her. Throughout dinner, their conversation flowed easily, touching on their separate journeys over the past months. Her research breakthroughs, his gradual return to public life, with a new purpose. They discovered shared tastes in literature and music, debated the merits of various films, found laughter where once there had been only tension and pain. By the time they finished dessert, a rich chocolate torte shared between them, Sherry felt as though she was seeing Ed clearly for the first time, without the filter of professional distance or ethical complications. What she saw only deepened the attraction that had begun in hospital rooms and therapy sessions. "Would you like to see the view from my hotel room?" Ed asked as they left the restaurant, his tone making it clear the invitation was both genuine and open to interpretation. The city lights are spectacular from the 25th floor. Sherry felt a momentary hesitation, not from uncertainty about her feelings, but from the weight of crossing this final threshold. "I'd like that," she said softly. The elevator ride to his floor was charged with anticipation, their hands finding each other in the enclosed space, fingers intertwining with deliberate intent. No words were needed. The decision had been made. In silent agreement, in the way their bodies had gravitated toward each other throughout the evening. Ed's suite was elegant and spacious, floor-to-ceiling windows offering the promised view of city lights spread below like earthbound stars. But neither paid much attention to the panorama as the door closed behind them. In the privacy of the suite, Ed set aside his cane and turned to face her. Vulnerability and desire mingled in his expression. "I've imagined this moment for months," he admitted, "being alone with you, without boundaries or titles between us." Sherry moved closer, her hand rising to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "So have I." When their lips met, it was with none of the hesitation of their first kiss on the hospital roof. This was a claiming, a recognition of desire too long denied, of connection too powerful to ignore. Ed's arms encircled her, drawing her against him, as the kiss deepened, became hungrier, more insistent. With gentle determination, Sherry guided him toward the bedroom, mindful of his balance, even as passion threatened to overwhelm caution. They took their time undressing each other, each revelation of skin met with reverent touch and murmured appreciation. When Ed hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features, Sherry understood without words. "Let me," she whispered, her hands confident and gentle as she helped him onto the bed, arranging pillows to support his back. What followed was a discovery far more intimate than their months of therapy, a learning of each other's bodies not for rehabilitation, but for pleasure. Sherry's medical knowledge transformed into loving awareness of what would bring him comfort and satisfaction. Ed's determination became tender persistence in bringing her to heights of pleasure she hadn't experienced before. Their love-making was careful at times, accommodating physical limitations without allowing them to diminish the passion between them. At other moments, it was surprisingly uninhibited, their connection transcending the constraints of injury and recovery. Afterward, lying together in the soft darkness, Sherry's head resting on Ed's chest, they spoke quietly of futures previously. "Unimagined. I never thought I'd feel this way again," Ed confessed, his fingers tracing patterns along her bare shoulder. "After the accident, after Lisa's betrayal, I believed that part of my life was over, not just physically, but emotionally." "And now?" Sherry asked, raising herself on one elbow to look at him. Ed's smile in the dim light was more open, more genuine than any she'd seen before. "Now I understand that what I lost made room for something far more precious, something real." As the night deepened around them, they talked of possibilities, her research, his foundation, the lives they might build separately or together. Nothing was decided, no promises made beyond the moment they were sharing, yet both felt a certainty that their paths, having converged against all odds, would not easily separate again. Outside the windows, the city continued its nocturnal rhythm, unaware that within one hotel room, two people who had found each other through pain and healing were discovering the most profound recovery of all, the restoration of hope, of connection, of love that saw beyond limitation to the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Chapter 8. Unexpected Return. 2 months after their reunion at the charity gala, Sherry awakened in Ed's penthouse apartment, sunlight streaming through floor to ceiling. Windows. These mornings had become her favorite moments, watching dawn break over the city skyline, Ed's arm draped possessively around her waist, their bodies fitting together as though designed for each other. She turned carefully in his embrace, studying his sleeping face. The lines of pain that had marked his features when they'd first met had softened, though not disappeared entirely. Recovery was ongoing, a daily battle he fought with quiet determination. But there was peace there now, a contentment that transformed him. Gently, she traced the outline of his jaw, marveling at how completely her life had changed. After years of maintaining professional distance with everyone, she had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with a former patient. The ethical questions that had once tormented her seemed distant now, replaced by certainty that what they'd found together was rare and precious. Ed stirred under her touch, his eyes opening slowly. "Good morning," he murmured, pulling her closer for a kiss that quickly deepened from affectionate to passionate. "Good morning yourself," Sherry replied when they finally parted, breathless. "You seem particularly energetic today." Ed's hand slid along the curve of her hip beneath the sheets. "I have excellent motivation to maintain my stamina." What followed was now beautifully familiar. The dance of their bodies, the knowing touches, the whispered encouragements. Over the weeks since their reunion, they'd learned each other thoroughly, discovering how to navigate Ed's physical limitations while maximizing pleasure for them both. This morning, Sherry straddled him, taking control, her movements deliberate. and unhurried as she watched his face transform with pleasure beneath her. Afterward, they lay tangled together, skin against skin, heartbeats gradually slowing to normal rhythm. "I could get used to waking up like this," Ed said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare back. "I think you already have," Sherry teased, though her smile held a question. They hadn't discussed the future in concrete terms, both hesitant to press too hard, too soon. Their relationship, intense as it was, remained officially undefined, a delicate balance of passionate nights, shared meals, and separate professional lives. Ed caught her expression, his own growing serious. "Move in with me," he said suddenly. "Not just on weekends, permanently." The proposal caught Sherry off guard. "Ed, I know it's fast," he acknowledged. "But after everything we've been through to find each other, why wait? Life is too unpredictable, too precious to waste on convention." Before Sherry could formulate a response, Ed's phone vibrated on the nightstand. He glanced at it with a frown. "Unknown number," he muttered, silencing it. "It could be important," Sherry suggested. Ed shook his head, turning his attention back to her. "Nothing is more important than this moment, than us." His phone began vibrating again immediately. With a sigh of frustration, he answered, "Graham, Sherry." Watched as his expression shifted from irritation to shock, the color draining from his face. "How did you get this number?" he demanded, his voice tight. A pause. "I see." Another, longer pause. "Fine. Text me the address. 1 hour." He ended the call, staring at the phone as though it had transformed into something dangerous. "Ed," Sherry prompted gently. "What's wrong?" "Lisa," he said, the name falling between them like a stone. "My ex-wife. She's in town and wants to see me." Sherry sat up, pulling the sheet around her. The woman who had betrayed Ed at his most vulnerable, who had taken half his wealth and tried to destroy his reputation, was suddenly, inexplicably, back in their lives. What could she possibly want after all this time? Sherry asked. Ed shook, his head already moving to the edge of the bed, reaching for his mobility aids with practiced motions. She wouldn't say, just that it's urgent. Sherry watched him dress, concern growing as she observed the tension in his shoulders, the tightness, around his mouth that hadn't been there in weeks. "I'll come with you," she offered. Ed turned to look at her, his expression softening momentarily. "I appreciate that more than I can say, but this is something I need to handle alone, at least initially." Though she understood, a cold knot of apprehension formed in Sherry's stomach. "Of course, just be careful, Ed. She hurt you profoundly once." "I'm not the same man she left," Ed reminded her, leaning down to kiss her with gentle reassurance. "I'm stronger now, in every way that matters." After he left, Sherry remained in his apartment, unable to shake the sense of foreboding that had settled over her. She busied herself with work emails, research notes, anything to distract from imagining what might be happening between Ed and the woman who had abandoned him at his lowest point. It was nearly evening when Ed returned, his face grave as he eased himself onto the sofa beside her. "She's dying," he said, without preamble. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 3 months, maybe less." Sherry took his hand, her doctor's compassion overriding the jealousy she was ashamed to acknowledge. "I'm sorry to hear that." "She was diagnosed 6 months ago," Ed continued, running his free hand through his hair. "Apparently she's been watching my recovery from afar, saw the interviews about my foundation, read about my progress. When she learned her condition was terminal, she became obsessed with seeing me one last time." "Why now, after all this time?" Sherry asked gently. "She claims it's for closure, for forgiveness," Ed replied, his voice hollow. "Says she can't die with the weight of what she did on her conscience, but there's something calculated about it. Even now, the timing, just as my life was finally rebuilding, it feels deliberate, as though she couldn't bear to see me happy without her." "And do you forgive her?" Sherry asked carefully. Ed was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Seeing her today, so diminished, so unlike the vibrant, selfish woman who left me, it was like looking at a stranger. I felt nothing at first, then pity, then anger that even now she's asking something of me." Sherry squeezed his hand supportively. "That's understandable. She wants to make amends," Ed said, "asked to meet regularly during her remaining time, to explain her actions." He looked directly at Sherry. "I told her I needed to discuss it with you first." The acknowledgement of her place in his decision-making process touched Sherry deeply. "What do you want to do?" "Part of me wants to tell her to go to hell," Ed said honestly. "But another part, the part you helped heal, wonders if hearing her out might provide closure. Not for her sake, but for mine." Sherry considered this, trying to separate her personal feelings from what might be best for Ed. "I think closure could be valuable, but only you can decide. If the potential benefit outweighs the cost of reopening old wounds." Ed nodded, seeming relieved by her balanced response. "There's something else," he added. "She claims her actions weren't entirely what they seemed, that there are things I don't know about why she left." A warning bell sounded in Sherry's mind. "Like what?" She wouldn't elaborate. Said she wants to explain everything face to face. "Over time." Ed's expression was troubled. "I'm not naive enough to take her at face value, but you're curious," Sherry finished for him. "Wouldn't you be?" Ed asked. "If someone who'd betrayed you claimed there was more to the story?" Sherry couldn't deny the human need for answers, for understanding, especially regarding profound pain. "Yes, I would be." The conversation was interrupted by Ed's phone. He checked the screen with a frown. "It's Lisa's doctor at Memorial Hospital. I gave him my number as her emergency contact. She has no one else." The implications of that simple statement, that Ed was still, despite everything, the person Lisa turned to in extremity, settled heavily between them. After a brief conversation, Ed ended the call. "She collapsed after our meeting. They've admitted her for pain management and hydration. Do you need to go?" Sherry asked, already knowing the answer. Ed's conflict was written plainly on his face. "She has no family here, no friends left after everything." "Go," Sherry said gently. "It's who you are, Ed, compassionate even to those who don't deserve it. It's one of the reasons I love you." The words slipped out naturally, the first time either had voiced the sentiment so directly. Ed's expression softened, his hand cupping her cheek. "I love you too," he said softly. "Nothing about Lisa's situation changes that. Nothing could." Yet as he left for the hospital, Sherry couldn't help but wonder if the sudden reappearance of his ex-wife, vulnerable and dying, might complicate the future they'd just begun to envision together. Not because Ed would reconcile with Lisa, Sherry trusted his feelings for her, but because the man she loved couldn't turn his back on someone suffering, even someone who had caused him immeasurable pain. It was one of his finest qualities, and right now it was the quality that threatened to disrupt the happiness they'd found together. Chapter 9. Testing Love. "You've been quiet tonight," Ed observed, watching Sherry push food around her plate. They were at his apartment, a month into Lisa's reappearance in their lives. Sherry looked up, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired. The clinical trial is in a critical phase." It wasn't entirely untrue. Her research was demanding, especially with the expanded trials of the Graham Protocol showing promising results across multiple rehabilitation centers. But the exhaustion weighing on her came from something deeper. For 4 weeks, Ed had divided his time between building his foundation, continuing his rehabilitation, nurturing their relationship, and visiting Lisa at the hospice where she'd been transferred. His compassion was admirable and increasingly difficult for Sherry to witness. "I received an interesting call today," she said, setting down her fork. from London Neurological Institute. Ed's eyebrows rose. The LNI? That's impressive. They've been following my research. They want me to head a new department focused on neural regeneration. Sherry watched his face carefully. It would mean relocating to London for at least 2 years. The news hung between them, its implications expanding to fill the silence. When would they need your answer? Ed asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. 2 weeks, Sherry replied. It's a remarkable opportunity. The funding, the facilities, the collaboration with European researchers. You should take it, Ed said with quiet certainty. The immediate response stung more than Sherry had anticipated. Just like that? No discussion of what it means for us? Ed reached across the table, taking her hand. I would never ask you to sacrifice your career for me. This kind of opportunity comes once in a lifetime. It would mean leaving everything here, leaving us. Sherry squeezed his hand. That's not a decision I make lightly. We could make it work, Ed suggested. I could visit regularly. My foundation doesn't require me to be physically present all the time. Sherry withdrew her hand gently. Long distance for 2 years, while you're still in recovery. That's not realistic. What are you saying? Ed's expression grew troubled. I'm saying I need to know what we're building before I make major life decisions around it. Sherry met his gaze directly. For weeks, I've watched you rush to Lisa's, sighed whenever she calls. I've listened to you recount her explanations, her regrets, her attempts to rewrite your history together. She's dying, Sherry, Ed reminded her softly. I know that. As a doctor, I have nothing but compassion for her situation. But as the woman who loves you... Sherry paused, gathering courage. I need to know where I stand. Ed looked genuinely confused. How can you question that? I love you. I asked you to move in with me. And since Lisa reappeared, we haven't discussed it again, Sherry pointed out. I understand your compassion for her, Ed. It's part of who you are, but it's created a shadow between us. That's not fair, Ed protested. I've been transparent about every conversation, every visit. Transparent, yes, but not present. Sherry felt tears threatening but held them back. Not fully here with me. Before Ed could respond, his phone vibrated with the distinctive tone he'd assigned to Lisa's hospice. The sound seemed to emphasize Sherry's point more effectively than any argument could have. Go, she said quietly. She needs you. Ed hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. This conversation isn't finished. No, Sherry agreed, but it's paused. Again. After Ed left, Sherry moved to the living room windows, staring out at the city lights. The London offer had come at precisely the wrong time. Or perhaps, she thought with a pang, exactly the right time. A clarity-forcing crisis that revealed the cracks in what she'd believed was solid foundation. Her phone chimed with a text from Dr. Elaine Watson, her colleague from the charity gala. Results from your latest trial participant are extraordinary. 60% restoration of function in previously non-responsive pathways. We need to discuss ASAP. Attached was a medical image. Neural scans showing remarkable regeneration in a patient who'd been treated with her protocol. Under normal circumstances, she would have immediately called Ed to share the triumph. Tonight, she simply set the phone aside, the victory hollow without him to celebrate it. As midnight approached with no word from Ed, Sherry made a decision. She packed an overnight bag with essentials and wrote a brief note. Heading to my apartment. Tonight, we both need space to think clearly. Call me tomorrow when you're ready to finish our conversation. 3 days passed before they managed to reconnect. 3 days in which Sherry threw herself into research, analysis, and contemplation of the London offer. 3 days in which her insomnia was punctuated by waves of nausea that she attributed to stress and emotional turmoil. When Ed finally appeared at her office door, he looked exhausted but resolute. "I've missed you," he said simply. "Come in," Sherry responded, closing the door behind him. "How is Lisa?" "Declining rapidly," Ed replied, lowering himself carefully into a chair across from her desk. "The doctors have moved her to palliative care only." Sympathy welled in Sherry's heart, despite her conflicted feelings. "I'm sorry to hear that." "She told me something yesterday," Ed continued, his expression troubled. "Something I'm still trying to process." Sherry waited, sensing the weight of whatever revelation Lisa had shared. "She claims she was coerced into leaving me," Ed said finally, "that someone from my company's board threatened to destroy her if she stood by me after the accident." Sherry's eyes widened. "That's quite an accusation. Do you believe her?" "Don't know," Ed admitted. "It sounds fantastical, but there were board members who wanted me out even before the accident. My injury gave them the perfect opportunity." "Why would she share this now, after all this time?" Sherry asked, professional skepticism tempering her emotional response. "She says guilt has been eating her alive, that she chose money and security over standing by me, and she's regretted it every day since." Ed ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Sherry had come to recognize. "She wants me to forgive her before she dies." "And have you?" The question emerged barely above a whisper. Ed looked directly at her. "I told her forgiveness isn't a gift I can give on demand, that it has to be earned and grown over time she doesn't have." Relief washed through Sherry, though she wasn't proud of the sentiment. "That seems fair. I also told her that while I might eventually forgive her actions, I could never forget their consequences." Ed leaned forward. "Or the fact that those consequences led me to you." The sincerity in his voice broke through some of the walls Sherry had been building over the past days. "I've been thinking about your London offer," Ed continued. "You're right, long distance would be difficult, especially now, which is why I want to come with you." The proposal caught Sherry completely off guard. "What? What about your foundation, your ongoing treatment?" "The foundation has a strong leadership team in place. I can oversee major decisions remotely." Ed's expression was determined. "As for my rehabilitation, London has excellent facilities. Dr. Chen has colleagues there who could continue my treatment." Sherry stared at him, processing the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "You would uproot your entire life. For me?" "For us," Ed corrected gently, "because what we've found is too precious to sacrifice to distance or circumstance." Emotion welled in Sherry's throat, making speech difficult. "Ed, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," he responded. "Say you believe me when I tell you that nothing, not Lisa's illness, not her revelations, not the complications of my recovery, changes how I feel about you." Before Sherry could formulate a response, a wave of nausea hit her with unexpected force. She paled visibly, one hand rising to her mouth. "Sherry." Ed's voice shifted from emotional to concerned. "Are you all right?" "I just need—" She didn't finish the sentence, bolting for the small private bathroom attached to her office. When she emerged several minutes later, Ed was waiting with a glass of water, worry etched across his features. "This is the third time." "This week," Sherry admitted, taking careful sips. "I've been feeling off for nearly 2 weeks now. Fatigue, sensitivity to smells, occasional dizziness. I dismissed it as stress from the London offer and everything else." Ed watched her carefully. "When was your last period?" The question made Sherry pause, mentally calculating. She'd been so consumed with work and the emotional turmoil of Lisa's return that she hadn't noticed. 6 weeks ago, maybe longer." Understanding dawned in Ed's eyes. "Could you be pregnant?" The possibility hung in the air between them. Sherry had considered it briefly when the symptoms first appeared, but had immediately dismissed it given Ed's medical history. Now, faced with his direct question, the pieces began falling into place. Her inexplicable emotional swings, the tenderness in her breasts she'd attributed to hormonal fluctuations, the sudden aversion to coffee she'd loved all her life. Possibility had occurred to her, of course. She was a doctor, familiar with the symptoms, but she'd dismissed it as virtually impossible, given Ed's supposed infertility. "It's highly unlikely," she said, medical rationality asserting itself. "Your specialists were quite definitive about the permanent nature of your condition." "Medical. Science isn't infallible," Ed reminded her. "You taught me that." Their eyes met across the room, the implications overwhelming if true. A child. A miracle neither had dared imagine possible. "I should run a test," Sherry said, medical training providing structure in the face of emotional uncertainty. "Whatever the result," Ed said softly, "know that I'm here, that my commitment to you, to us, is absolute." But as Sherry looked at him, she couldn't quite silence the voice of doubt. Was his renewed dedication genuine, or simply a reaction to Lisa's impending death and the possibility of new life? Was he choosing her, or merely the idea of fatherhood? He'd thought forever beyond his reach. The London offer loomed in her mind, an escape hatch perhaps, but also a legitimate opportunity to advance her research on a global scale, a chance to put distance between herself and the complications that had arisen, to determine if what she and Ed had built could withstand real challenges. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to process everything, the offer, your proposal. To join me, Lisa's revelations, and the possibility of pregnancy." Ed nodded, respecting her need for space, though his expression revealed how difficult it was. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk again." As he left her office, Sherry placed a hand on her abdomen, wondering if a new life was indeed growing within her, a child conceived against all medical probability, a testament to the body's capacity for miracles, or perhaps, she thought with sudden clarity, a sign that Ed's infertility had been yet another lie in the complicated web Lisa had woven around them both. The thought, once formed, could not be unthought. And with it came a decision that would alter all their lives in ways none could yet imagine. Chapter 10. Full Circle. London's persistent rain tapped against the windows of Sherry's townhouse as she watched her children sleeping. 2 years had passed since she'd left New York. 2 years of building a new life centered around her miraculous triplets and groundbreaking research. The Graham Protocol was now standard treatment for previously irreversible spinal injuries. Across Europe, while at home, 3 perfect 10-month-old babies embodied a different kind of miracle: Ava, Ethan, and Michael. Their faces perfect miniature reflections of their father. The doorbell's chime startled her from her reverie. Visitors were rare, especially at this hour. Activating the security panel, Sherry froze at the image displayed. Ed Graham stood on her doorstep, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He walked with only a slight limp now, no cane or support visible. Her heart thundered as she descended the stairs. She'd imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed explanations and apologies, yet nothing had prepared her for the reality of seeing him again. Opening the door, she stood speechless as his gaze took her in. 2 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. 2 years of searching, of following every lead, every mention of your research in medical journals. "How did you find me?" Sherry managed, stepping back to allow him entry from the rain. "Your paper on neural regeneration. In infants mentioned a specific London hospital." Ed moved into the foyer, water dripping from his coat. "I took a chance." His gaze swept over her, lingering on her face, as though memorizing features he'd feared forgotten. "You disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye, just a brief resignation letter and an empty apartment. I had my reasons, Sherry said quietly. Lisa died 6 weeks after you left, Ed continued. Her final weeks were illuminating. She confessed everything, Sherry, everything. Sherry's breath caught. What do you mean? There was no coercion from my board members, no external pressure driving her betrayal. Ed's expression hardened. It was calculated from the beginning. She'd been planning to leave for months before my accident, had already consulted divorce attorneys about maximizing her settlement. Then why the elaborate story at the end? Manipulation, her final attempt to secure my forgiveness, my attention. Ed shook his head. After her death, her attorney delivered a package of documents she'd instructed be given to me only after she was gone. She called it her final confession. What did you find? Sherry asked softly. Everything, Ed replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. Personal journals spanning years, detailing how she'd married me primarily for financial security. Email exchanges with her divorce attorney dating back 18 months before my accident, strategizing how to maximize her settlement. Medical records showing she deliberately sabotaged my treatments after the accident to extend my recovery time and gain sympathy during divorce proceedings. Sherry gasped. That's criminal, and that's not all, Ed continued. The most damning evidence was a series of receipts and correspondence with 3 different fertility specialists, all colleagues of her cousin. She paid them substantial amounts to falsify test results, showing me as permanently infertile, knowing how much having children someday meant to me. Sherry gripped the wall for support. Lied? The specialists who diagnosed my infertility, colleagues of her cousin, paid to falsify test results. Ed's gaze intensified. She wanted to ensure I'd never have a family with anyone else. Her final act of control. A cry from upstairs shattered the moment. Then another, the chain reaction of triplets sensing one another's distress. Ed froze, his attention shifting to the sounds. You have children, he stated, a question embedded in the observation. Sherry took a deep breath. Yes. Are you married? The question clearly cost him to ask. No. Another cry, louder now. Sherry knew she couldn't delay the inevitable. I should check on them. Would you like to come upstairs? The nursery was bathed in soft light, 3 cribs arranged. Along the walls, only Ethan was fully awake, his little arms reaching up as Sherry approached. She lifted him gently, turning to face Ed, who stood frozen in the doorway. Recognition dawned instantly in his eyes. The baby's features, his hazel eyes, the distinctive Graham-cleft chin were unmistakable. He's mine, Ed whispered. Not a question, but a statement of profound certainty. They all are, Sherry confirmed, gesturing to the other 2 cribs where Ava and Michael were settling back to sleep. Triplets. 10 months old now. Ed moved forward as if in a trance, peering into each crib before returning his gaze to the child in Sherry's arms. Ethan studied him curiously, tiny fingers reaching toward his father's face. Why didn't you tell me? Ed asked, voice breaking. Why disappear when you discovered you were pregnant? I took the pregnancy test the day after our last conversation, Sherry explained. The same day I received a package of photographs, you and Lisa together at her hospice, holding hands, her head on your shoulder. Anonymous, with a note claiming you were reconciling with your dying wife. That never happened, Ed said immediately. The photos must have been manipulated. I know that now, Sherry admitted. But then, combined with her sudden revelations about being coerced, your divided attention, I panicked. I convinced myself you were being drawn back to her out of guilt and obligation, that my pregnancy would only complicate an impossible situation. So you disappeared to London. Ed's voice held no accusation, only profound sadness, denying me the chance to know my children, to know I even had children. I thought I was protecting all of us from more pain, Sherry said softly. It was the wrong decision, made in fear and hormones and sleep deprivation. By the time I learned of Lisa's death and began to doubt my assumptions, I was 7 months pregnant with high-risk triplets, unable to travel. After they were born, the challenges of raising 3 infants alone while establishing my department, time just slipped away. Ed reached out tentatively, asking silent permission. Sherry placed Ethan in his father's arms. The baby settled immediately, as though recognizing the connection between them. "They've been the greatest joy of my life," Sherry whispered, watching Ed cradle his son with natural ease. "But there's been a hole in our family that nothing could fill. They deserve to know their father, and you deserve to know them." "And us?" Ed asked, looking up from the baby to meet her eyes. "What do we deserve, Sherry?" The question hung between them, weighted with 2 years of separation and unspoken truths. "A second chance," she answered simply. "If you can forgive me." Ed's free arm circled her waist, drawing her close as Ethan nestled against his chest. "There's nothing to forgive. We both made mistakes, believed lies, let fear guide our choices. What matters is now. What matters is this." His kiss was gentle. At first, tentative after so long apart, but quickly deepened with the passion that had always defined them. When they parted, breathless, Ethan gurgled happily between them, tiny hands grasping at both his parents. "I never stopped loving you," Ed confessed. "Not for a single day." "Neither did I," Sherry whispered against his lips. "I've told them stories about their brave, brilliant father every night since they were born." 6 months later, under an arbor of white roses in the London Neurological Institute's garden, Sherry Brantner became Sherry Graham in an intimate ceremony attended by colleagues, friends, and the 3 babies who had brought them full circle. The triplets, now 16 months old and developing distinct personalities, were central to the ceremony. Serious little Michael, already showing his father's analytical mind, solemnly carried the rings on a tiny pillow, his brow furrowed in concentration. Spirited Ava, with her mother's expressive eyes and determined nature, scattered rose petals from her stroller, giggling with delight at each handful. And sensitive Ethan, the peacemaker who had first bonded with Ed that rainy night, officiated from his father's arms as vows were exchanged, occasionally reaching to touch both parents' faces as if ensuring they remained connected. "From doctor and patient to partners in every sense," Ed said, as he slid the ring onto Sherry's finger. "You healed more than my body. You restored my faith in love, in possibility, in miracles. And you taught me that true healing transcends medicine," Sherry responded, her own voice thick with emotion. "That some connections are meant to endure, no matter what obstacles arise." That night, with the triplets asleep under the watchful eye of a night nurse, Ed and Sherry celebrated their union with the passionate intensity that had always characterized their relationship. In the moonlight filtering through their bedroom window, they rediscovered each other, their bodies expressing the love their words could never fully capture. "I would save you from falling again in an instant," Ed whispered against her skin, "even knowing all the pain that would follow. Because it led to this," Sherry finished for him, drawing him closer, their bodies moving in perfect rhythm. "To us," Ed agreed, "to our family, to a future neither of us could have imagined that first day in the hospital room." As they lay entwined afterward, Sherry's head on Ed's chest, just above the surgical scars that had once mapped his tragedy, the sound of his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From broken trust to profound healing, from professional boundaries to boundless love, from paralysis to passion, from infertility to the miraculous triplets sleeping peacefully down the hall. Some might call it fate, others medical mystery. But as Sherry drifted to sleep in her husband's arms, she knew it by its simplest, most powerful name: love.